So my name is Jenny Say-Leon. I'm the Conservation Evaluation and Research Manager at FrogLife, and I've only recently taken up this role. We went through a restructure and I've worked at FrogLife for a long time, but on the education side, and I've now moved across to the science side. So it's really nice to be here this evening and get to take part in a Toads on Roads event and start to get to meet some of the toad patrollers. This evening, we're going to be shining a light on the common toad and presenting back some of the initial research results from Emma Gardner's work from the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. And I wanted to start by welcoming you and thanking you for taking the time to respond to Emma's survey. We've got 73 groups responding in total. And as you'll see this evening, this has helped us to provide some really fascinating insights. And we're hosting this event and sharing the initial results with you as a thank you for taking part. So we really hope that you enjoy it and find it as interesting as we have. You all know FrogLife as managing the Toads on Roads project, and this project has been going on for something like 35 years, I think now, and it's not only helped millions of toads to safely cross the roads in the UK, but it's also collected invaluable long-term data on toads and other amphibians in the UK. And in 2016, we used this data alongside matching data from Switzerland to publish research that highlighted the huge declines that common toads have experienced. And it was calculated that it was 68% decline on average across the UK over 30 years. This was a really important finding, and to be able to write that down and publish it and then promote it. And as a result of the research, FrogLife launched a series of large-scale projects focused on toads, and that was working in London, where we launched Tales of Amphibian Discovery, so toad, and Yorkshire, where we have the same project. And we've recently launched a project in Sussex, which is Discovering Dew Ponds. And although toad is not in the title of that one, it is really part of the development for it. So it was, I guess it was the inspiration for it. It was looking for somewhere for toads to find an oasis and a refuge in the southeast, where the declines were the highest. This year, the research findings have also contributed to getting toad status on the IUCN Red List, increased to near threatened from least concern. And whilst that's not a good outcome in itself, and it's not anything we want to hear, it's really important that we recognise the threats that are faced by toads. And it's a common misconception to think that toads are fine because they're called common toads, so everyone thinks they're fine and they're common and they exist everywhere. The Toads on Roads project is mainly unfunded. It's really difficult to get long-term funding for a project like this. So we are hugely grateful to you for volunteering your time, and to everyone that becomes a FrogLife friend, makes a donation, uses FrogLife Ecological Services, as all that money goes into our core funding that pays for unfunded projects like Toads on Roads. I wanted to take the time to also say what you might not know about FrogLife. So often when people get involved with FrogLife, they might know the project that they get involved with or part of a project that they get involved with, but then there's obviously lots of other parts to the organisation. So FrogLife works across 3 main work streams: transforming landscapes, transforming lives, and transforming research. And we really specialise in engaging those that might not otherwise take part in conservation activities, and deliver various social inclusion projects, including our Green Pathways project that works with disadvantaged young people. And we have Green Pathways for Life now that works with people suffering from dementia. We're also not just frogs, so we're FrogLife, but we actually represent all 13 native UK amphibian and reptile species. And to give you some of the kind of headline stats, in 2020, we created 529 new habitats across 582 hectares of land with the support of 232 volunteers. We also delivered 2,219 sessions to nearly 16,000 people across the UK. And with your help, we rescued nearly 72,000 toads. And all of that was through a pandemic when most staff were on furlough and most of the country was in various states of lockdown. So those figures are down on other years, but I think it's still kind of amazing to see the amount of work that is achieved across the organisation. So hopefully that kind of sets the scene and makes sure that you know where Toads on Roads fits in with Frog Life and Frog Life's work. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Emma Gardner, Dr. Emma Gardner, who is giving us the main talk tonight and presenting her findings. Emma is a quantitative ecologist and modeller. She's a research fellow at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I was looking at her profile on their website earlier, and it's amazing the things that she has done. She's a very well researched lady. In her spare time, Emma moonlights as a toad patroller at the Bagley Wood Toad Patrol. So she really understands what it's like to be involved in a toad patrol and is a keen supporter of toads. The project that Emma is working on, that this work has come out of, is called How Many Trees Should We Plant and Where? And it's modelling the landscape level benefits and biodiversity consequences of woodland creation. As a kind of layman's term, she's creating a tool that shows you where you should plant woodlands and how that will impact the other species in the area. So there's lots of focus at the moment on planting trees, but obviously you can't just plant trees everywhere. You've got to do it in the right places. And so this tool is going to be really useful for that. And she's focusing on several key species, one of which is the toad. So Emma has been able to produce this research as a kind of part of that. So I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to Emma.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I'll just try and share the screen. Can you see that okay? Does that look good to you?
Yeah.
Brilliant, getting some nods. That's great. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. It's really great to see so many people here. As Jenny said, I work at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and I'm going to share with you the work that I've been doing over the last couple of months on toads. And that's working really closely with Jenny and Ashley at Frog Life, and also with Angie and Chris at ARG UK. And together we've been trying to understand how toads use and move between habitats. And the information that you've sent through to us has been really key in helping us to do that. So we really want to better understand how toads use landscapes so that we can then go on and share this knowledge with other people to help them better take toads' needs into account when they're thinking about making changes to landscapes, like creating woodlands, but also other changes that you might think that you might want to make to our landscapes. So we live on a crowded island. You probably don't need me to tell you that. So we place many demands on our landscapes. We require it to produce our food. We put our houses on it. We spend our free time in it. And these are just the things that people want from landscapes. That's not to mention the needs of all the other species that we share those landscapes with. So I belong to a network of researchers all studying how we can make better and fairer decisions about how we use land to benefit both people and the natural environment as a whole. So our network is called the Landscape Decisions Programme, and it includes researchers spread right across the country. And some of those researchers are working on really quite big problems, like how we might change the way we use land in future to better cope with climate change or to try and halt climate change. And also there's a whole group of researchers within our network who are looking at issues around people's access to land and how historically, when we've been making decisions about land as a society, there have been groups of people who's not had their views taken into account. And they're trying to come up with new ways to help the voices of these groups of people be heard within landscape decision making. And then the part of the network that I belong to is the part that's looking at the biodiversity of our landscapes and how changes we make to landscapes can affect that biodiversity. So my work is really all about trying to understand how other species use landscapes and how they perceive landscapes. And as Jenny said, I don't just work on toads, I also work in a whole range of species. And all these species use landscapes in a slightly different way. So they rely on different types of habitats. Some of them can travel quite a long way between the habitats that they use, others can't, and they must have everything they need in easy reach. So when we were choosing which species to study or to really focus on within the project that I currently work on, there was absolutely no question that toads would be one of them. And there was two reasons for that. Jenny has already given you a hint to the first one. The first one is that as well as being a researcher, I am also a toad patroller. So this is the crossing that I help at, and I think there are a couple of other Bagley Wood toaders on the call tonight listening in. So our toads spend most of their lives in Bagley Wood itself, which is a large commercially managed woodland owned by one of the Oxford colleges. And it includes patches of semi-natural ancient woodland, but also large stands of conifers, which are periodically harvested for timber. And the woodland itself is cut through by two main roads. There are other smaller roads, but there are two main ones. One of which is this dual carriageway here, which is basically impassable to pretty much everything. And the other one is this road here, which is the main commuter route between Oxford and Abingdon. And this is the road that we help our toads across. And they're all heading for this breeding pond here, which is a man-made but now pretty much naturalised breeding pond within the grounds of a school. So just like you, I'm out there every spring seeing firsthand the challenges that toads have getting around in our modern landscapes. The second reason that we really wanted to include toads in this project is that when people who are not toad patrollers think of amphibians, they think of ponds. And they very often forget that amphibians actually spend a lot of their time, in fact, most of their time if they're a toad, in surrounding terrestrial habitats. And really, we shouldn't forget this because that is the essence of an amphibian. That's how they trump fish in the evolutionary stakes, the fact that they can get out of the pond and go somewhere else. That is the unique selling point of an amphibian. So we really wanted to help people become more aware of this, of the importance of these surrounding terrestrial habitats for supporting amphibian populations. So what we decided to do is we wanted to build a model that demonstrates to people how toads use landscapes. So a computer model that can show people for a given breeding pond, what habitats around that pond would the toads be most likely to be using? And where would those toads be most likely to be spending their time when they're not in the pond? So how do we go about using a computer to simulate where toads go? Well, we start just like the toads do with the breeding pond location. So this red splodge is the location of our toads breeding pond. And you can see just how big their woodland is. Here it is. And this is the dual carriageway that cuts through it. This up here is Oxford and down here is Abingdon. So you can see it really is right in between these two urban areas. There have been a lot of studies done basically following toads around, trying to work out how far they roam around their breeding ponds. And the general consensus is they spread out to around about 2 kilometres around their pond. And we expect that the number of toads you find in the landscape to decrease with distance away from the pond, because the further away you go, the less toads are going to bother to walk that far. But we know that toads don't just spread out equally in all directions. There are some habitats they prefer more than others. So we needed some sort of estimate of which habitats toads prefer to use. So to get that, we sent a questionnaire to 10 amphibian experts. So this was a really, really detailed questionnaire. It had 77 habitat types listed in it. We wanted to make sure that we'd covered absolutely every habitat possible that occurs within our country. And we asked the experts to score each habitat type according to how good it was at providing resources for foraging toads. And these experts included researchers who've spent many years studying toads and also consultants and conservationists who are out there on the ground with these animals. So we then combined the scores that all the experts gave to get an estimate for how good each habitat type is for foraging toads in the experts' opinion. And this just shows you some of the answers that the experts gave. So the experts said that deciduous woodland, they expected to be a very good foraging habitat for toads. They gave it the highest score possible. They said coniferous woodland was not as good for toads, but it was okay. They said improved grassland and arable lands were not that great for toads. They get them a fairly low foraging score. And all the experts agreed that urban centres with loads of concrete were basically pretty rubbish habitats for toads. There was not much point in toads going there to try and make a living. So once we had these scores for how good different habitat types were, it meant that we could take our map of where the habitats are in the landscape and convert it into a map of where the good habitat types are, how good each one is for toads. as far as the experts were concerned. So in this picture, the darker green areas are predicted to be the better toad foraging habitats. And you can see in the landscape that our toads live in, the best foraging habitats are expected to be provided by the woodlands. And these paler green areas are the suburban areas, which are kind of okay for the toads to forage in. The yellow areas are the arable fields, which the experts said were probably not so good for the toads. And these peachy colours are patches of very urban areas that are not predicted to be much use for the toads. So we can put this into our model, and we can then come up with slightly better predictions, which say that not only do the toads spend more time closer to their pond than further away, but they also spend more time in the better quality foraging habitats. So in this picture, the darker green areas are where the model is predicting more toads will be spending their time. And you can see that the model is already predicting that our Bagley wood toads are spending most of their time in the wood, which is what we observe in reality, which is kind of a good sign. But all us toad patrollers know that it's not this simple. The toads can't just walk freely across the landscape to access any habitat they want. We need to account for the effect of roads, which can represent a significant barrier to amphibian movement. So how do we go about incorporating the effects of roads and their traffic on amphibians? So just as there have been lots of studies done trying to measure how far toads go around their ponds, there have also been studies done trying to measure the effect of traffic on travelling amphibians. And this graph is from a study done in Denmark, where the researchers tried to calculate how the chances of an amphibian successfully getting across a road on its own depend on the amount of traffic that that road carries. So these calculations are done for amphibians walking across the road on their own, not assisted by any toad patrollers. So for all those of us who have seen firsthand what happens when amphibians and cars meet on a road, this is actually a pretty sad graph to look at. So the researchers found that newts were actually least likely to be able to get across a road safely on their own, because even though they're small, they are the slowest walkers. The researchers actually found that toads and frogs were in fact equally likely to be killed while trying to cross a road. Now, for those of us who have both frogs and toads at our crossings, that is a little bit surprising and feels a bit counterintuitive, because when you're there stood on the road, it's very obvious that the frogs hop across the road much faster than the toads, who just tend to walk across. But the researchers found that it was this very act of hopping that made the frogs more likely to be hit, because it extends their bodies, as opposed to the toads, who tend to hunker down and make themselves smaller. So the Department for Transport in this country collects records of how much traffic travels on different types of roads. So we can use this really quite grim graph to help us estimate the risk that different types of roads pose to our travelling amphibians. So I'm going to focus now just on the toads, who are represented by this dashed line here. So according to the Department for Transport, our rural minor roads typically carry 1,000 vehicles a day. So that's like the figure for an average rural minor road. That means if a toad tries to cross a rural minor road in this country, there's a 20% chance that they won't make it across safely on their own. That's 1 in 5 toads are expected to be lost just crossing our rural minor roads. If that minor road is in an urban area, it carries more traffic. And already we're down to only a 50-50 chance of any toad that tries to cross it getting safely to the other side on their own. So that's minor roads. A roads in this country may look like this, or they may look like this. So the Department for Transport does not distinguish between these two types. They lump them all together when they calculate their statistics. A roads don't carry 1,000 vehicles a day. They typically carry 12,000 vehicles a day. If you're a toad, that means there's a 75% chance that you won't make it across an A road on your own in rural areas. In urban areas, that goes up to 85% chance that you won't make it across safely on your own. So that means if 100 toads tried to cross an urban A road on their own without toad patrollers, only 15 of them were expected, according to these researchers' calculations, to make it safely across to the other side. That's 15 out of 100. And these calculations include the fact that amphibians like to travel after dark. So at the extreme end in 2019, traffic flow on our motorways was measured at 83,300 vehicles per day, sorry. And that amount of traffic is not even considered on this graph. So these researchers didn't even consider roads that busy. And I think you probably don't even need to be a toad patroller to realise that a motorway may as well be a brick wall as far as a toad is concerned. So we can take this information and we can use it to try and map for all the roads that are in the landscape that we're studying, what is the risk that they pose to travelling amphibians based on their road class. So this is just an approximation, because obviously we all know of minor roads that are real rat runs, and they get far more traffic than you would expect a normal minor road to take. So that's not included in these estimates, but it just gives us a starting place to get an idea of the effect of roads on our amphibians. So we can include this in our model. So we've got our predictions from our model of where the toads would be if they could move freely across the landscape if there was no traffic on the roads. We can incorporate the risk that the different types of roads are expected to pose to our amphibians. And we can see already how our model predicts how much our foraging toads distribution is curtailed by the presence of traffic on these roads. So our model is now predicting that toads forage outwards from the central breeding pond, spending more time in nearby and higher quality habitats, but limited by their ability to safely reach those foraging habitats. So these are predictions in the absence of toad patrollers. So I've shown you quite a few pictures now of the landscape that our toads live in at Bagley Wood. I'm going to show you a couple of images now of other toad crossings who show equally stark effects from the presence of roads. So this is the Church Road crossing in Gloucestershire. And in this picture here, again, the red splodges where their breeding pond is, and the white areas are where the model predicts lots of toads to be spending their time, and the dark areas are where there are fewer or no toads expected to be. And you can see this really, really hard line here, where the model predicts hardly any toads, or almost no toads, that originate in this breeding pond are able to access habitat on the other side of this line. And you can see it corresponds to this motorway here. It doesn't mean that there are no toads living over here. There could very well be breeding ponds here with toads foraging around them, but the model says that any toads that originate in this breeding pond are very unlikely to get over this side. Whereas they do have a better chance of crossing these smaller roads here. And we know, of course, at this location, there are patrollers on hand to help them do that. So you can see these very white areas where lots of toads are predicted to be spending their time. And when we look at the satellite image, you can see they correspond to a bit of woodland here and some more woodland and rough grassland up here. So this is another crossing. This is the New Hinksey toad crossing on the edge of Oxford. And this is the lake that these toads breed in. And you can see again this hard line where the habitat they can access is abruptly cut off by the presence of this trunk road here. But if you look on the other side of the breeding pond, you can see the number of toads is predicted to decrease really quite quickly, but in a much more fuzzy way. It's not a hard line, it's sort of a fuzzy edge here. And in this area, there is a network of residential streets, and this is actually where the patrol operates. And you can see that the model is predicting that this is really quite a risky area for toads, because although these individual roads are quite small, there are a lot of them in a very small area. So when we run the model to see where the toads might be going, we really do get quite a different perspective on this situation. And the model's suggesting that actually only a very small proportion of the toads are going into this suburban area to forage. And actually a large number of the toads are potentially going in the opposite direction and spending their time in these water meadows. So this is an area I know myself. And when I first saw these predictions, I was really surprised, because this here is a railway line. So this railway line is a pretty substantial physical and therefore mental barrier to the way we as people think about this landscape. If you're a person, you can't just stroll across this railway line and access these fields on the other side. There's one footbridge in one place and that's it. But if you're a toad, it's probably a different story. Now, we don't know for certain, but we suspect that railway lines are potentially easier for toads to cross than roads are, because the toads are very small and they could potentially go underneath the rails. So if you're a toad, these fields are possibly a lot more accessible from this lake than they are if you're a person. So this particular patrol said to us that they were concerned about their toads, that they weren't seeing as many toads as they had done previously. And they'd still noticed this effect even during the lockdown when there was less traffic. So they were worried about what might be going on with their toads. So this model kind of gives us an overview of what, a slightly different perspective of what's going on. And it suggests that actually this particular breeding population of toads is potentially relying on quite a wide range of habitats to keep it going, not just this suburban area. So if the patrol are seeing less toads in this suburban area, perhaps something is going on in these suburbs, maybe something's changing. Maybe more people are paving their gardens so there's less habitat for the toads to use. So maybe fewer of the toads that breed in this pond are choosing to go and spend their time that way and therefore hibernate over there. Or it could be that maybe something is going on in these water meadows. Perhaps the habitat here is changing, maybe something about the management has changed, or maybe for some reason it's not able to support as many toads as it used to. So the total number of toads breeding in this pond and therefore foraging out in all directions is reduced. We don't know for certain what the answer is, and in many ways the model can't tell us what the answer is, but it can give us clues as to where we might want to go to look for the answer on the ground. But should we believe what the model says? How do we know the predictions are correct? Is it predicting that toads, where it's predicting toads are going, is that really where the toads are going? So that's where you all came to our rescue and you helped us out. So last spring, as many of you know, we sent out a survey form to all the toad patrols in the country, and we asked you, which habitats do your migrating toads appear to come from? So we wanted to be able to check whether the habitats the model predicted the toads were using were the ones they were actually seen using in real life. So 73 toad patrols returned completed survey forms, which was absolutely fantastic. We were completely bowled away by how many of you sent back your survey forms. And when we put all of your answers together, we found the top 3 habitats that you were reporting seeing toads coming from were broadleaf woodland, mixed woodland, and rough semi-natural grassland. So these were the 3 habitat types that most patrols, the largest number of patrols, were reporting either yes or maybe to their toads coming from these habitat types. So suburban areas were the next most reported habitat after the different types of grassland. And other reported habitats included hedgerows, stone walls, road verges, ditches, scrub, golf courses, and railway embankments. So many of these are quite sort of fine scale habitat types that are not often included when people make maps of the different habitats that exist in a landscape. People often overlook them. And yet you were telling us that in many cases, these were quite important and useful habitats for your toads. And the breeding sites that you said your toads were using ranged from small farm and garden ponds up to lakes and even reservoirs. And in some cases, they were using canals. So they were using a whole different range of water bodies to breed in. So for each toad crossing who sent back a completed form of where they thought the habitats were coming from, we identified the breeding pond based on your information and satellite imagery, and we ran the model to simulate where the toads were expected to be foraging. And we then added up how many toads were predicted to be foraging in each habitat type. So these panels down here just show you a few images from our simulations for just some of the crossings that we simulated. And you can see at some crossings, the toads are predicted to have a choice of a few good big habitat patches to spend their time in. Whereas at other crossings, the model predicts that these toads are much more reliant on just one much smaller patch of habitat to keep them going. But did the model get it right? So to answer this question, we combine the model simulations for all the sites to rank the predicted level of use of each habitat by an average toad population. So which habitats were expected to be most used by the populations of toads we simulated and which were predicted to be least used. And we compared this to the observed level of use, so ranks based on the percentage of patrols responding yes or maybe to their toads coming from each habitat type. And we found there was a strong positive correlation between the model's predictions and your observations. So those habitats that the model predicted to be most used by the populations of toads we simulated were the habitats that you were most often reporting seeing toads coming from. So this is really great. This means that we can use the model with much greater confidence to try and predict what habitats toads are using in areas where there aren't toad patrollers there to keep an eye on them. So an interesting thing to notice about this graph is that we've got some habitats here that are predicted to be not very frequently used by an average toad population. And they include habitats like heathland. So this doesn't mean that heathland isn't an important habitat for toads. In fact, in upland landscapes where there aren't many woodlands and other things, toads may be really very reliant on heathland and it may provide a really, really good habitat for them to use. But it's sitting down here on the graph because across all the crossings we simulated, only a few of them had heathland around for the toads to use. So that's always something to bear in mind with graphs like this. So your observations have helped us to build a model that shows how toads use landscapes. And crucially, you've helped us to check that the model's predictions are realistic so that we can then take this model forward and use it to predict how toads might be using other types of landscapes. So next year, we're going to be moving on to the second phase of our research project, where we're going to be working with land managers, advisors and policymakers in 6 different case study areas. So these are all very, very different landscapes, but they have one thing in common, and that's that they're all thinking about making quite substantial changes to these landscapes. And in particular, as Jenny said earlier, they are all involved in woodland creation initiatives. And as we know from your responses, woodland can be a really important habitat for toads. So we're going to be testing whether our models can help the people in these areas to adapt their plans to incorporate the needs of toads and some of the other species we have been working with, so that these changes they're planning to make to these landscapes don't just benefit people and provide the things that people want from those landscapes, but they also have the opportunity to benefit toads and other species as well. And the toad model that we've been building will be made freely available online for anyone to use, so that people can use it to visualize how toads might be using the landscapes near them. And if changes are planned for those landscapes, they can use it to get an idea of what those changes might mean for the toads that live there. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much for listening, and a huge thank you again for taking part in our Toad Patroller survey and sharing your knowledge with us. None of this would have been possible without you.